Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, November 15th. We begin tonight with what the Public Health Agency of Canada says is a flu epidemic in Canada. This comes after the test positivity rate nearly doubled from the last week of October to the first week of November. The agency's Flu Watch report indicates a flu epidemic most years when the threshold of a 5% positivity rate is surpassed. But it says influenza levels are higher than would have been expected when compared to pre-pandemic years. The healthcare system is dealing with a triple threat of respiratory viruses. This includes COVID-19 and higher than normal levels of flu and respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV. Meanwhile, Canadian store shelves and pharmacies will be restocked with more children's pain and fever medications in coming weeks. Health Canada is currently distributing an imported supply of children's acetaminophen and ibuprofen to hospitals, but officials did not give many further details during questions at a House of Commons committee today. A months-long shortage of Tylenol, Advil, and similar brands has been fueled by a triple threat of COVID-19, influenza, and RSV. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki is the latest high-ranking official to testify at the public inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. She says the Ottawa mayor's request for 1,800 police reinforcements during the Freedom Convoy protest in February caught the Mounties off guard. She says she didn't know that Ottawa police were looking for such a large number of officers until she saw a letter from then-Mayor Jim Watson. It was addressed to the federal and provincial governments. She says usually requests are made from one police service to another and not through politicians. All right, turning to a new report by Auditor General Karen Hogan, which says the federal government doesn't know if the things it's doing to reduce chronic homelessness are working. Ms. Hogan says no organization has taken the lead on the federal government's goal of cutting chronic homelessness in half by 2028. Because of that, she says the federal government is unlikely to achieve that goal. Ms. Hogan's office released reports this morning on the government's performance on a number of issues. Now, this includes surveying Arctic waters and emergency management in First Nations. Moving to UN climate talks in Egypt, where Canada is advocating for the expansion of carbon pricing in the fight against climate change. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault says Canada is challenging the rest of the world to expand the use of carbon pricing. Mr. Guilbeault is hosting an event at the UN climate talks today, which is aimed at tripling carbon pricing coverage within 8 years. He says 8 other countries and the European Commission are already on board. The idea is similar to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which Canada launched with the UK in 2017. All right, well, back at home, the Canadian Real Estate Association says home sales in October posted their first monthly gain since February. They rose 1.3% from the previous month, according to CREA. The agency says sales were up on a month-over-month basis in 60% of all local markets. Compared with a year ago, home sales in October were down 36%. The actual national average home price was down 9.9% from the same month last year. Turning our attention to Quebec, where the oversight body for professional orders has launched an investigation, which is looking into why half of Quebec's nursing students have failed their written license exam in September. Office des Professions de Québec has received 27 complaints. Quebec's professional nursing order is blaming the dismal results on the COVID-19 pandemic and said that the exam has remained unchanged for the last couple of years. The preceding exam in March 2022 had a 71% success rate and 81% passed in September 2021. Apple is rolling out a new system that will help some iPhone users in Canada better reach emergency responders, even in the event that they can't connect to cellular or Wi-Fi service. The tech giant says its new emergency SOS system will allow anyone with an iPhone 14 to connect to a satellite to report an emergency or call for help. It says the service will be free for the first 2 years. The announcement comes as Canadian telecommunications companies are facing pressure to ensure people can reach emergency responders during major outages. Canada's women's soccer team was in São Paulo to battle Brazil in an international friendly. It was the second meeting between the two squads in less than a week. Canada, which is ranked 7th in the world, topped 9th ranked Brazil 2-1. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at harassment and economics. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. The governor of the Bank of Canada has told a central bank conference on diversity and equity that the economics discipline is having a Me Too reckoning. Tiff Macklem acknowledged that his female colleagues have faced harassment that he has never had to face. But Mr. Macklem told the event in Toronto that he's worked to create a culture of respect at the Bank of Canada. He adds that harassment of any kind can never be ignored, excused, or brushed away. Well, joining us now to continue this conversation is Dr. Marina Adshade. She is an economics and public policy professor at the University of British Columbia and an economics expert on the role of women in society. Dr. Adshade, welcome to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, we know that women have been speaking out against harassment and sexual abuse in the workforce for years, decades even. So what is the current state of this issue in the economic sector in particular?
So economics is very male dominated. And in the last couple of years, when we've had the Me Too movement, a lot of the very male dominated industries have had to face the fact that it's just simply more difficult for women in those industries. Women face a lot of harassment, they face a lot of discrimination. And just like the governor of the Bank of Canada said, they face a lot of circumstances that the men just don't simply face. What's been kind of interesting is that whereas the Me Too movement in general started years ago, economics kind of managed to slide under the radar for a few years. But things have really accelerated in the last, I would say, 6 weeks in economics, where there's been it started as a trickle and then it turned into a wave of women coming forward and um, bringing forward their complaints about the way that they are treated, the way they're treated at conferences, the way they're treated when they present their research. And it's really forced the profession as a whole to have this conversation.
Now, Mr. Macklem is calling this a Me Too reckoning. So, what does that look like in the economics industry? What does he mean by Me Too reckoning?
I think that it's so interesting because, of course, the women in economics have been having this conversation. As you said, we've been having this conversation for decades. And economics, I think, has had a recognition that it has a gender problem. So that part isn't really new. The reckoning, I think, is that there are some individuals who are having to face some consequences for their own behavior. And that really is the reckoning. And some fairly high profile economists have been called out for their behavior and publicly. And of course, I think the profession is known as a whole that there's a number of people who have been problematic over the years, but now it's become very public. And so that's been very uncomfortable for the profession as a whole.
And it's interesting that Mr. Macklem made these remarks along with news of an economic slowdown. So, how does the issue of harassment in the economics discipline impact the overall economy?
Well, I mean, I'm unsurprised the Bank of Canada make the statement. Canada is actually, I think, very, very forward thinking when it comes to gender, and they've worked quite hard for gender equality within the bank. And the reason they've done that is not just because of a sense of fairness, but actually everybody benefits when we have better gender representation in the economics profession. Because of course, economists do research that guide policymakers, and those policies affect everyone in the economy, including women. And if we don't have women's voices in the economics profession, it adversely affects policies, but also it's not good for economic growth. It's not good for the general health of the economy to have only one group of people's voices represented.
And are there any certain sectors in the economic discipline that are facing harassment more than others? As you say, the Bank of Canada is quite the leader when it comes to equality. So, are there any certain sectors that are facing this issue more?
Yeah, I mean, so finance is particularly has a particularly bad reputation. Central banking actually, outside of the Bank of Canada, has quite a bad reputation, and macroeconomics, which is kind of both of those things come under that umbrella. Those are the professions that traditionally have been very male dominated. They are very masculine professions. It's If I could just tell you a quick story, is a friend of mine went to a macro conference, and she says the nice thing about macro conferences is that when she goes to the bathroom, there's so few women she can cry there all by herself because the conferences are very, very difficult for women. So it's really, he's in the right position to be making these comments because it really is those areas of economics that have been problematic, most problematic.
Clearly, a conversation that needs to happen. Now, a really quick 20 seconds left here, Doctor, but if you could leave us with one message for officials when it comes to addressing this, what would it be?
I would say that if we care about economic growth, if we care about standards of living, these gender issues, they're not just about fairness. They're really best for the overall health of the economy, and they need to be addressed so that Canada can be competitive with other nations that are addressing this pretty proactively.
And Dr. Adshade, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Well, thank you for having me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily News. Ukraine's president is comparing the recapture of Kherson to the Allied landings in France on D-Day in the Second World War. Speaking via video link to a Group of 20 summit in Indonesia, Volodymyr Zelensky says both moments are watersheds on the road to eventual victory. The retaking of Kherson was one of Ukraine's biggest successes in the nearly 9-month-old Russian invasion. But large parts of eastern and southern Ukraine remain under Russian control. And fighting continues, with strikes reported on Ukraine's power grid and city centers. Well, with us now to discuss the state of the war in Ukraine is John Hardie, Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Hardie, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we jump to Kherson, let's talk about what's been hitting headlines today. Missile strikes by Russia targeting Ukraine's energy grid have seeped over the border to Poland, ended up killing 2 people in Poland. Now, considering that Poland is a NATO member, let us know what the latest developments in this situation is and how this will likely impact the war going forward.
Sure. So I think first we need to kind of take a breath and just wait for all the details to come out. There'll be a technical investigation. At that point, it sounds like Poland is convened their National Security Council. Perhaps there'll be some sort of Article 4 consultations under the NATO treaty, which basically just allows any member to call for consultations with other members. I expect all the allies will keep a level head. This sort of thing isn't really something you start a war over. If it was a Russian missile, which it sounds like it was, I think we'll assume it's accidental until proven otherwise.
All right. Well, in terms of the situation in Kherson, we know Ukraine's president seems to indicate that the war is close to ending following the retaking of the city. But is that really the case, especially considering these recent missile attacks?
Well, I wouldn't say the war is anywhere close to over. Unfortunately, it will probably drag out for quite some time, certainly into 2023. From there, it's really anyone's guess. But there is a lot of hard fighting left ahead for Ukraine. They've made a lot of really significant gains in Kherson and elsewhere, but there is a good bit of tough fighting ahead.
And how might the success at Kherson impact Ukrainian military operations and strategy going forward, especially as the winter months approach?
Sure. So it's going to be a huge boost in morale, first thing, and probably the opposite for the Russians. I think both sides will redeploy some forces away from that area towards other sectors, either because on the Ukrainian side they want to launch another counteroffensive. The Russians, I think, will have to counter that. Ukraine has the strategic initiative, so they're able to dictate when and where the next big battle happens. And I think Russia will kind of have to react to that, and they might try to reinforce some of the areas where they're still trying to make gains.
Now, considering, as you say, this might be impacting Russia's morale, what factors led to Russia's withdrawal after this 8-month occupation in Kherson?
Sure. So I think that the main thing is that Ukraine for months now has been striking the key bridges over which Russia brought in supplies to supply its troops on the western side of the bank of the river, and over time, just continuing to supply those forces just became untenable. The position just became untenable. I think the Russian command made the military prudent decision to push Putin to withdraw over the river, which he eventually, obviously did, despite I think resisting that urge for a while.
And how is Russia reacting to the recapture of Kherson, both operationally and strategically?
Sure. So I mentioned the redeployment. I think that's already underway. Some forces seem to be moving to the Zaporizhia Oblast. Russia's trying to consolidate a line of defense along the eastern bank of the Dnieper. I think Ukraine would probably have a pretty tough time crossing that river. That would not be an easy operation. So I expect the kind of center of the fighting to shift elsewhere.
All right, Mr. Hardie, a quick 30 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as this war progresses?
So for me, it's Russia's mobilization. I want to see, some mobilized forces have already entered the fray. They don't seem very well trained or equipped. I want to see if the rest of them, which I think is probably the majority, get any sort of better training in the weeks and months ahead.
All right, Mr. Hardie, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And after the break, we're going to be taking a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. As the world's population hits 8 billion people today, according to the UN. Cholera is spreading around Haiti. Iran is urged to free detained peaceful protesters. And a new report finds that automatic braking reduces accidents. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world after the break. So stay with us. Forum Daily. We'll be right back. The United Nations says the world's population has reached the 8 billion mark. The projection came in a report released in July, which says much of the growth expected between now and 2050 is coming from just 8 countries. Half of it is from sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, Congo, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The report also says India is expected to overtake China next year as the world's most populous country. A senior U.S. intelligence official says Russian missiles have crossed into NATO member Poland and killed 2 people. Polish media reported that 2 people died Tuesday afternoon after a projectile struck an area where grain was drying in a village near the border with Ukraine. NATO is investigating, while the Russian Defense Ministry is denying any responsibility. All right, well, in China, the ruling party has called for strict adherence to the hardline zero-COVID policy. This comes in an apparent attempt to guide public perceptions after regulations were eased slightly in some places. The party's flagship newspaper said in an editorial that China must unswervingly implement the policy, which requires mass obligatory testing and places millions under lockdown. Local party officials are under immense pressure to stop outbreaks, this even though they've tried to slightly ease quarantine and other antivirus measures to reduce costs and disruption. Cholera cases are overwhelming Haiti. Experts are warning the situation could worsen now that the country is bustling once again. This comes after a paralyzing fuel blockade that lasted 2 months. Dr. Jean-T Fies is a spokesman for Haiti's Ministry of Health, and he tells the Associated Press that people are back on the streets and likely spreading cholera. This comes as the government struggles to find life-saving equipment, including IV supplies, amid an ongoing discussion on whether to request cholera vaccines. At least 156 people have died, and more than 6,900 are hospitalized. Now, this is according to the Pan American Health Organization and Haiti's government. However, officials believe the numbers are much higher. Former U.S. President Donald Trump is preparing to launch his 3rd campaign for the White House. Mr. Trump is expected to make a formal announcement at his home in Palm Beach, Florida tonight. It comes as Republicans face disappointing results in this week's midterm elections. Only one president in U.S. history, Grover Cleveland in the late 19th century, has served 2 non-consecutive terms. The UN Human Rights Office is calling on Iran's government to immediately release thousands of people who have been detained for participating in peaceful protests. It has faulted the Islamic Republic's increasing harshness. This comes as Western countries seek to ratchet up scrutiny at the top UN human rights body of Tehran's crackdown on demonstrators. Meanwhile, the family of an imprisoned Egyptian activist says they've received a letter from him saying he has ended his hunger strike. In a statement, the family of Alaa Abdel Fattah says his mother has received a short note in her son's handwriting via prison authorities. It asks her to visit him on Thursday and bring a cake to celebrate his 41st birthday. Mr. Abdel Fattah's months-long hunger strike has drawn attention to Egypt's heavy suppression of speech and political activity. All right, well, back in the U.S., 2 new studies show that automatic emergency braking can cut the number of rear-end automobile crashes in half and reduce pickup truck crashes by more than 40%. The studies, by a government auto industry partnership and the insurance industry, each used crash data to make the calculations. Automatic emergency braking can stop vehicles if a crash is imminent or slow them to make a crash less serious. Climate activists continue to capture the world's attention by throwing food and other liquids on famous glass-protected paintings, the latest being in Austria. Now, this is where activists attacked a famous painting by artist Gustav Klimt. Members of the group Last Generation Austria tweeted on Tuesday that they had targeted the 1915 painting Death and Life at the Leopold Museum in Vienna. This was to protest their government's use of fossil energies. The painting wasn't damaged. The iconic Cleveland home from the 1983 film A Christmas Story is up for sale. In 2006, a new owner bought the house and made it look like the movie's studio setting, where 9-year-old Ralphie and the Parker family lived. It has now become a piece of Cleveland history and has grown into one of the city's best-known tourist attractions. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all of our commentary programming and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you next time. Take care, Canada.